For today I shall regale you with information, facts, and a few fancies about myself, Dr. Benjamin Franklin. I was born a poor boy, number 15, 15 of 17 children. Can you believe? I was born January 17th, 1706. Now, those of you with even a paltry mathematical skill can surge forward in time and know that in the pivotal year 1776, I was a vital man of vigor at only age 70. I'm going to begin to tell you some facts about my early years. For the beginning of anything is most important, as the beginning of all of us are. My mother was Abia Folger Franklin. For many years, I thought her name to be Abida, for my mother read me the entire Bible many times over. But it was Abia Folger Franklin. She was my father's second wife. His first wife, Anne Child, gave my father 7 children before she died, most likely of exhaustion. But my father found a wonderful second wife in my mother, Abia Folger. Abia Folger was a saint. I know that you hear young men call their mothers a saint, but my mother was truly a saint. Everything good, everything proper, everything full of character and integrity I learned at my mother's knee. But conversely, my father Josiah Franklin, everything bad and small and petty and evil I learned from my father. Now, my father, as I said, brought to his second marriage 7 children, a ready-made family. But my mother, God bless her soul, welcomed them and treated them with great equanimity. And I, number 15, the last, the youngest son, I was her favorite. And in my mother, she fostered a love of women. She was God's angel to me. She taught me to read by age 3. Yes, I was destined to be a child protege. I was enrolled in Boston Latin Grammar School, Boston, where I was born. And my father, Josiah Franklin, had a candle and soap making business in Boston. Now you may say, what in the world do candles and soaps have to do with one another? But they both come from animal fat and tallow, and they both have a little perfumery added and a little coloring, and there you have it. Candles, of course, have the wicks placed in them, which I was to find later in life I had no talent for doing, placing those wicks. My father used to say, of course anyone can place a wick straight, Lee, but he found that there were some who could not. My wicks were much more creative as they zigzagged down the candlestick. And of course, soaps. Soaps and candles. In his business, there was a huge vat of this tallow mixture with a little perfumery and a little coloring added, and the heat of the place was horrendous. And the paddle wheel that churned that mixture to keep it from solidifying before it could be poured into the forms for the soap and the candles with the wicks. It had to be kept turning. So my father, in his infinite wisdom, though I was destined to become an excellent scholar, pulled me from Boston Latin Grammar School to become an indentured servant. Yes, I was his child. I was his flesh and blood. But back in the 1770s, you see, parents literally owned and controlled their children to do with whatever they saw fit. Now, I had a step brother from my father's first family. As I have said to you, he brought to the union with my mother 7 children, and the eldest son was James. James detested me, and my father detested me, only slightly less. When my father would enter the room and see me sitting with my head upon the knee of my mother, and she reading to me, dearest, dearest mother, Abia Folger Franklin, his expression would alter and change instantly, and the hatred and malice and envy. You see, he wanted no competition with my mother's affection. He gave her 10 children, so that in all Josiah fathered 17. She accepted the 7 from his first marriage, and he gave her 10, of which I was number 15. But I, her favorite, I adored her. But he, small and petty and evil man, though my natural father detested me. And so there came an opportunity for my brother, James, my half-brother, had a newspaper in this colonial New England. The New England Courant, Coureant was what it was called, but it was not prospering. And James did not want to pay an employee. So my father looked at me with loathing and thought, here is a solution. I will bind Benjamin Franklin to James Franklin, and Benjamin will be out of the home. I will not have to come downstairs and see him looking lovingly at my mother, nor see her looking so tenderly and lovingly at Benjamin. And so my father made out a legal document for 7 years. 7 years. I was to be an indentured servant, legally bound to working for my brother at the New England Courant newspaper. One of the lessons I will share with you today, ladies and gentlemen of all ages here, is that you must not ever give up. No, indeed, you must persevere, even in the worst of times when you face physical calamity and tragedy. For James beat me on a regular basis, left me without food, and when I would go outside in the evening to empty the papers and the trash, he would often lock the door of the New England Courant behind me, and I could see him up above, standing at the window of his bedroom above the New England Courant newspaper office, looking down upon this young man, 11 years old. Shame on you, James. but he would not unlock the door. Many the night I slept on the street. Many the night I had nothing to eat but the victuals I could find in the garbage. And the clothing I wore was ridiculous, not the fine thread you see upon me today. All I could find was what I could find and make do with in the garbage, and that became my life. I was to have 7 years, and it was legal. Legal. If I ran away, I was a criminal. But you know what? Ladies and gentlemen of all ages here today, the Lord blesses us just as my dear mother had told me. One of her favorite verses, "For I know what plans I have for you, plans to prosper and uplift you." That's what the Lord says to us. We don't know those plans. I didn't know those plans. I knew I was in hell itself. But I was learning the newspaper trade, and it was to be the bulwark of my life forever. James wanted me to set the type. He never was pleased with how quickly I set the type, and he would take the typesetting ruler, a span of this long and 3 inches wide wood, and he would come and hit my knuckles and hands. They were black and blue, as black and blue as the palms and fingers of the type with which I set those papers. But I grew. I soon learned the newspaper business, and friends and neighbors, truth had nothing to do with it. Oh no, truth had nothing to do with that headline that James called a hook. A hook indeed, for the newspaper hawkers would stand upon the street and call out that headline, trying to sell all of their newspapers. So I set the type. I hung the papers to dry. At night I kept the fires going to keep those papers drying, so that in the morning they were taken down and hawked upon the street. I knew as I grew older that I had the ability to write. I had been a brilliant student in Boston Latin Grammar School. I went to James, my half-brother, praise Lord, half-brother. James, I know that I can write for the New England Current. Will you allow me to? It couldn't do anything but to improve the circulation and make us more money. But my brother, he regaled himself with laughter and hit himself upon the knee, and in short he said, "No, never." And he hit me and threw me out into the street. But I persevered. That is another skill that you must learn. Though you are beaten, though you face pain and torment and tragedy, you must soldier on and persevere. And I persevered, and I thought of an idea. I would write a column, an editorial, for they were so popular, under a pseudonym, a false name. What should I pick? Who should I invent? It was my first pseudonym, first of many, I may add, and I picked an old woman, a woman with a filthy mouth, a woman who expressed her beliefs and let the chips fall where they may. Her name? Mrs. Silence Do-Good. Yes, that's it. Silence Do-Good, because you couldn't silence her. She was bound and determined to give her opinion. And so, how to get this brilliant editorial to my brother? I was to go on and write 14 14 editorials were printed in the New England Courant, and here's what I did. I wrote out the editorial, I signed Mrs. Silence Do-Good, I folded them, and I slipped them underneath the door of my brother's newspaper in Boston. It worked beautifully until number 14. On number 14, just as I was sliding, which I think was the most brilliant of all of my opuses, beneath the door, my brother James opened the door, and there I was. I made excuse that an old mongrel woman, a fish seller's wife, had given it to me to put beneath the door, but he would have none of it. And he beat me severely and threw me into the cellar, where I would still be starving to this day, had I not stacked boxes upon one another and escaped. And I left. I left. And in so doing, I broke that legal contract, that indentureship, of which I had 3 years left, for I was not yet 15. I left, and I found out another thing, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, for you to remember, that strangers, not your family, strangers are often the ones that will lend a hand to you to lift you up. For I hit the road, no money, pitiful clothing, to New York first, and then to Philadelphia. Well, what was I to do? The only trade that I knew was the newspaper trade. But I knew it, and I excelled at it, and I got a job in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I was soon to be 15. At 15 years of age, I was a scandal to look at. My knickers did not match my waistcoat, did not match my coat, did not match anything. I had no stockings. My shoes were 2 different kinds, mind you, for left and right. But in Philadelphia, with only a few shillings, dollars, I found a boarding house near where I worked. The new newspaper where I would work. And it was called the Reed Family Boarding House, R-E-A-D. And wouldn't you know, Mrs. Reed, you've got a lovely daughter. Oh, she did. There was a young woman who was nearly 17. Oh, she was an older woman compared to my, let's call it 15 years. But she was lovely. And she waved at me. And so, with my first small paycheck, I let a room at the Reed boarding house in Philadelphia. I had a job at the newspaper office, and before you know, Deborah Reed and myself were hiding in the shadows of the staircase and kissing. I knew that we could not be trusted to be moral. I have always loved women, credit my lovely mother for that. And so I went to Mrs. Reed. She and her husband had the boarding house and also sold a combination of snake oil medicine which promised to cure everything from toe jam to dandruff to bad breath. This elixir or snake oil medicine she continued to sell for many years, as did Deborah. I asked Mrs. Reed for the hand of Deborah in marriage, but Mrs. Reed reminded me of my brother James, for she laughed heartily and said, "No, forget it." When I reminded her that we could both share my room and I would continue to work at the newspaper office, more frivolity. And so I found that I had to leave Philadelphia. That was a chapter I bid adieu. I had been told by the governor himself that I might find employment and success in England, across the Atlantic, which they called the Pond. And so I worked my passage across the Atlantic. I wrote to Deborah often before finally telling her to find another, that I would be away for many years, but that I loved her. Deborah Reed reminded me of my wonderful mother, Abaya, so much so. In England, I loved the metropolitan life, the libraries, the fire department that was organized, the postal service, and in my spare time when not working for the paper, I swam. Yes, you never thought of Benjamin Franklin as a swimmer, I would dare say. I swam in the murky River Thames. I cut quite a dashing figure, and I won many a chafing cup. But within 2 years, I felt I had to return home, to Philadelphia, to Deborah. When I returned home to Philadelphia, when I met with Deborah, I had a fair-sized savings. I again postured marriage, only to find out she had already been married to a ne'er-do-well who took advantage of her and stole her dowry and was off, absconding with it, and had not been heard of. Now, there was a law in the 1770s, and it was not a good one. It said that if you were married and you wished to divorce, you had to have the physicality of your spouse in order to divorce them. No physicality, no human spouse there, then you were married to them forever. And this is why I am known as the most happily married unmarried man in history. We could not marry. John Rogers had absconded with her money, and there was no dowry left. And so Deborah and I moved in together. But I hazard to say it was not before I had, in an amorous moment of misjudgment, fathered an illegitimate child who would be named William. Deborah and I were quite happy, but whenever it was time to go across the seas again to England, to learn how a true metropolitan city functioned, to take that knowledge and use it for America, Deborah would not accompany me. But she did allow me to have my illegitimate son, William, move into our home to live with us. We were to have a son and a daughter, but our son that we had together, Deborah and I, died early of smallpox. And here I will tell you another lesson. When I had lived in Philadelphia with my brother James and I both refused to support inoculations for young people. We felt it was too hazardous. Well, my new beautiful son was to die because I was too stupid to allow inoculations. As you go through life, you will learn lessons that are terribly expensive and costly. And so our home was left with William, my illegitimate child, that my beautiful wife, Deborah Reed Franklin, raised as her own, and our daughter, Sarah Sally Franklin. And we were happy. In the 1730s, I began to make my fortune. I have heard critical people say that it was Deborah's fortune from the snake oil business. Nothing could be more ridiculous and more untrue. I began in 1734 to write a small almanac. Again, I favored anonymity, where I did not put my name, Benjamin Franklin. I chose a name, Poor Richard. Well, we were all poor back then. Maybe we're all poor today, wanting more money, wanting a better life. Poor Richard's almanac had planting information for farmers, all about the weather that was to come, all about the seasons, all about when to plant, but it also had little witty, wise sayings that came to be called aphorisms and epigrams. Let's see if you remember any of them. You can say them to yourselves. A stitch in time, yes, saves 9. Early to bed and early to rise, yes, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Fish and visitors smell after 3 days. Well, that little Poor Richard's almanac I kept going for 25 years. And do you know what? More homes in the American colonies had Poor Richard's almanac in them than the Bible. I'm not saying that's a good thing, I'm just saying that's a fact. Then I began to invent. I'd always had an inquisitive mind. I came up with a small little pot-bellied stove. I named it the Franklin stove, and it was very good. It excelled at putting out heat. More money. I developed the flexible catheter. Now, for those of you that have ever had to have a catheter, if it weren't flexible, how would you like it? You wouldn't. I developed bifocal glasses so that you didn't have to have 2 pairs when you sat and read. One for looking at other people at a distance, and one for seeing that print up close. Bifocal glasses were ingenious. I have several pair myself. The harmonica. Wow! Mozart and Beethoven loved it. And soon every musician thought they had to have one. And guess what else I invented? My mother didn't have one. But when she held her little Frankie, little Benny, she rocked in that straight chair. So I developed curved runners. I invented, I gave you the rocking chair so that when you have your little ones, rock them to sleep. In the interim, I became a Freemason. I became the Grand Mason of Philadelphia. I headed for Postmaster General after I began the first libraries from my visits to England. I developed a fire department with a bucket brigade. When the siren was sounded, the people came out of their houses to help one another. God help us all if we ever stop helping one another. So I contributed. So I became known. I became the head of the Philadelphia militia. But I am not saying that I was always popular. Every time I went to England on official business, I had to leave Deborah. I loved Deborah, but Deborah was terrified of water. You can't, or you couldn't at that time, get to England across that pond if you were terrified of water and wouldn't go on it. One of those years, Deborah died while I was away. I was vilified, but I attempted to explain as best I could that I had adored her. But there was a greater need for me to see what was going on. And what was going on was that England was taxing the American colonies to death. Anything of value was being taxed heavily and making it too expensive to even procure. There was salt being taxed. There was sugar being taxed. There was tea being taxed. There was, of course, gunpowder being taxed. There was flax and wool and linsey woolsey, and everything was being taxed. And the colonists hated King George and England, who just wanted the colonies for the money. You all know of the Boston Tea Party and the tea being thrown into Boston Harbor, but do you know the tipping point came with the Stamp Act? Many don't even know about the Stamp Act. Well, let me tell you. The British conceived of a very unique form of making even more money. And they said that every time there was to be a legal contract or document, such as a birth certificate, a marriage license, a contract for owning a slave, a contract for owning an indentured servant, a contract of any sort, that it had to be put on special paper. Oh, only England provided the special paper. And to prove that it was legal, it had to have a stamp, a special little stamp. The colonies were in an uproar, and I went over to England to speak against the Stamp Act, and I got it repealed. But before that, mobs appeared at my home, ready to burn it to the ground, because they thought that because I was a newspaper man, favored the Stamp Act. I was burned in effigy, which means a figure of Dr. Franklin was burned. As the years progressed, heading to 1776, I was a representative of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My gout, which is 100 times worse than arthritis and affects the joints, had affected me greatly. I was living in Philadelphia with my daughter, Sally Barquet. Occasionally, I would have myself carried on a chaise lounge to the convention center, but it was not for publicity, of course. I was honored to help Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and others, John Jay, Henry Lighthorse Lee. What great men we had. We knew that we ran the danger of death for ourselves and our family. And the expression, surely we must all hang together, or we will all hang separately, was ever so true. Somehow, General Washington and the American Continental Army won, although the Redcoats were stationed, in fact, at the beginning of the war in Philadelphia and Boston and other cities. How we did it, only God knows, for He led us there. After America's colonies were claimed as independent, the Articles of Confederation were simply too weak. They gave all power to the states. Every state had its own currency. You couldn't cross the state border line and do business unless you had your currency from your state turned into their currency. It was horrible. We didn't have a United States Navy. We didn't have our one army to protect us. And England was attacking our ships again, impressing soldiers, which meant capturing them, forcing them to work on their British ships. It was not a good situation. And so ultimately, General George Washington stood up in 1784, the first meeting of the Constitutional Congress at Mount Vernon, but not many were there. I was not there. The next year it was held at Annapolis, Maryland, but not many more. And General Washington wrote to me, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, abroad in England, and begged me to come in 1787 to the next constitutional meeting in Philadelphia. It began in May, and it was going to be another hot summer. The small states and the large states could not stop fighting. They were bickering like children. They respected me because I was the eldest at the Constitutional Convention at 81 years of age. My gout was so bad I often could not walk. But I did two things. I told them that they must begin each constitutional meeting with prayer, invoking the blessing of God, that in that year, eventually, we would prevail with decency. Slavery was a terrible sticking point. Saying that we were all totally equal. James Madison was brilliant, and he and I together came up with the Connecticut Compromise, which said that the Senate would have all equal representation for all states, but the House of Representatives would be based on its representation for the number of its population and the size of its state. And therefore, finally, on September 17th, the bells rang out and the Constitution, praise the Lord, was signed. When I left Constitution Hall, barely able to walk, a woman from the crowd yelled at me, "What have you given us, Dr. Franklin? A democracy? What?" And I yelled back, "We've given you a republic, madam, if you can keep it. If you can keep it indeed, for it will be assailed. Our very liberties and freedoms will fight against one another." And James Madison was to step forward and say one of the reasons it was finally signed, he said he would write a Bill of Rights. And he would address the fact that he thought the most dangerous thing of all was our ability to protest. James Madison said that our freedoms might ultimately destroy us if we did not have the character to stand up for what we knew. Everyone knows in their heart what is right, but we must stand up for it and fight against those who would drag us down. Pray God, there are always more people with character than without. I, a poor boy who never finished school, who was beaten by my own half-brother, signed into virtual slavery by my own father, I was afforded degrees from Harvard and Yale, from St. Andrews, from Oxford. I am Dr. Benjamin Franklin, and I pray that we keep this republic.